Welcome to Brightest Bulbs, technology podcast and webinars for energy-minded professionals, brought to you by Cummins. You are in the right place if you're looking to learn about the latest innovations in energy or find out what is in the works to build a sustainable energy future. Today we will explore the connection between data and energy. We will start with some of the technologies that are now household names, including 5G, IoT, and beyond. We will then talk about the backbone, the not so well-known infrastructure behind these technologies, data centers. This is Thomas Hillick, host of Brightest Bulbs podcast and webinars. Today, Sarah Griffith will join us. You will hear Sarah's insights from her 20 years of unique experience partnering with various sectors in exploring power generation solutions. Sarah, thanks for joining today's episode. Excited to have you. We start each episode with a short question to learn a little more about you, and today's question fits well with our topic ahead. If you could only use one piece of technology, what would it be?
Thomas, it's funny of you to ask me this 12 months ago. I might have been tempted to say that I thoroughly enjoyed my spare time with no technology, so my answer here would have to be my cell phone. I think keeping connectivity with everyone at the moment is an absolute necessity right now.
We will talk about digitalization and energy. But before we jump there, why don't we start with some of the basics? 5G, Internet of Things, IoT, and edge computing are some of the popular digitalization terms we frequently hear. How do these different technologies come together, Sarah?
Yeah, I think one of the ways for us to understand this a little more might be to think about how the technology actually shows up to various user types. So, whether you're a residential, a commercial, or an industrial user, we're all likely to be using these IoT devices in one way or another. So I think about as a residential user, we might have smart home devices like security cameras, light switches, all as a part of our home automation. Or we may be driving a car with some level of autonomous thinking. I know my driver assist features in my vehicle took a little getting used to, but as I think about it, I actually now love them. From a commercial user perspective, in things like healthcare, retail, you might be using these devices to monitor health, to kind of track inventory, or for e-commerce through smart devices. Think about all those online purchases that you might be making or seeing, or virtual doctor's visits right now. As industrial users of IoT for analytics of their supply chain, kind of tracking equipment performance, and for robotic manufacturing, Intel did a comprehensive study lately on this and found out that healthcare, commercial businesses, and manufacturing operations actually lead others in the use of IoT devices. And most of these devices, Thomas, rely on mobile communications to relay data back and forth. And this is kind of where the 5G, 4G comes into play for mobile communications. As we've had more IoT devices, we need more capacity for them to operate, which 5G can offer us. So when you think of some of these IoT devices, what you want is a need for speed and low latency, and where that latency is actually a delay. And so it's the amount of delay or time it takes to send information from one point to the next. So this latency is usually measured in milliseconds. So think about how at some point in time over the last few weeks, many of us will have experienced that kind of video call screen freeze moment. So if it's life-threatening in some instances, this latency is not low enough. And so really think about driving an autonomous vehicle, which is loaded with sensors and analyzing large amounts of data, which needs to make instantaneous decisions. So there's really no room for an error or delay in sending this data to a faraway data center to get it analyzed. And this is a similar situation for many of our IoT devices, including healthcare applications where life safety is critical. So this need for low latency, Thomas, brings up kind of edge computing. And edge computing is simply the activity of processing and storing data close to where the data is generated and used, in contrast to sending the data far away to a central data center for processing. So 5G brings up the high speed, but it's not enough by itself to deliver the low latency needs for many of these IoT devices. You really need a combination of edge computing and 5G to deliver this ultra-low latency. And this high-speed mobile network offering by 5G combined with this edge computing that takes place near the end user.
Great, Sarah. You're answering here many questions I've had for a long time. I never really knew what latency was. So, we all have IoT devices at home, at work, in our cars. Many of them need mobile communication networks. 5G comes into play and brings the expanded capacity, high speed and increased reliability for these devices to operate. Meanwhile, edge computing brings the computing activity near these devices and end users, delivering the needed lower latency. All coming together. Where do data centers fall into this picture, Sarah?
Well, we just talked about all the ways that devices